This is TWiT.
So, for want of a screw, Apple's Mac Pro was almost lost. Remember what a big deal it was that they were assembling the black trash can Mac in Texas, in the United States? New York Times technology story, a tiny screw shows why iPhones won't be assembled in the U.S. of A. When Apple began making the $3,000 Mac Pro in Austin, it struggled, according to 3 people who worked on the project and spoke on the condition of anonymity because of confidentiality agreements, it struggled to find the screws.
Yeah.
In China, rather, Apple relied on factories that can produce all the custom screws on a minute's notice. What do you want? We'll make it. You got it tomorrow.
Yeah.
In Texas, turns out screw suppliers a little harder to come by. They couldn't even test new versions of the computer because the 20-person machine shop that Apple's contractor was relying on could produce only 1,000 screws a day at most. The Times says the screw shortage was one of several problems that postponed sales of the computer for months. Remember, they announced it in December or no, in September or October, and we didn't get it till January. Well, now we know. It was because of the screws, and in fact, we got screwed. Apple had to go to China. They actually ordered the screws from China.
Yeah.
In order to mass produce the computer in
Home Depot.
Texas.
I mean, did they check?
They're custom. That's the problem. They're not. Yeah.
It's an old story, but bears repeating time and time again. This is why Steve Jobs told Obama manufacturing jobs are not coming back. It's not because of cheap labor. It's not because of favorable tax situations. It's because there is a business order inside Shenzhen and other manufacturing cities where you can have a company that does nothing but manufacture screws. Which means they have the capacity to build any screw you want on pretty much any demand at any quantity at any time frame, because that's all they do. Instead of having to contract a machining company that is filled with incredibly talented people in the latest technology, but they're a machining company that will build pretty much anything. So when you say we need to build screws right now, they may not have ever had to manufacture this particular part in this particular quantity. And also, you're talking about a company that every time you have every problem that could be encountered in manufacturing a screw, they've encountered it and they've solved it. Every time if Samsung, for instance, came to them with they need a weird thread count, or they need a weird profile to fit this weird sort of part that they've got that can't be any bigger or any wider than this, they will figure that out. And then when Apple comes and asks them for something similar, because they're also trying to get rid of this bezel, or they're trying to put this component someplace, they don't have to start from square one. They've already had experience making this screw. That's the problem. It's not even, again, it's not the fact that labor costs so much less is not the biggest problem. I think the fact that there is apparently a culture of we're workers, we are just supposed to do what we're told, is also not as big a deal as the fact that you just can't get what you need at the time frame you need it. If that's going to cause a company like Apple to ever want to build something in the United States of America so drastically, because of the economic situations or because of embargoes, that might mean that they're going to have to say, well, guess what? You cannot have that custom screw. You have to order something from this catalog that we know that we've got a factory in the Dakotas that is just building these screws. They've been doing it for 30 years. They build each one out of one block of aspen log, and they know how to do this sort of stuff. It's really, really difficult problem. There's no solution to it.
So I have to say a little bit that this article might look a little like a justifying piece from Apple, because you're right. Part of it is saying, well, it's not to save money that we manufacture in China. In fact, Cook said in late 2017,
that too.
In the U.S., but it is that too. In the U.S., you could have a meeting of tooling engineers. I'm not sure we could fill the room. In China, you could fill multiple football fields. They also, in this article, pointed out, look, we spend $60 billion last year with 9,000 American suppliers, 450,000 jobs. Apple, this is a little bit, and I would suspect Apple had a little something to do with the writing of this article, a little bit of a message to the White House that, oh, no, really, we're not only are we helping American jobs, but we have to manufacture in China. And I mean, you could probably say, look, if Apple decided to use more standard parts, or Apple spent some energy, doing what they did in China already, which is to build up manufacturing in the United States. I mean, a lot of this is because Apple intentionally created a manufacturing giant in Shenzhen.
Yeah. It's also it's a sum of so many things. Like a lot of decisions we decided to make. I'm saying like North America, America and Canada. What we chose to value, how we chose to do education. My grandfather moved here at the age of 60, and he got a job instantly because he was a machinist, and we were desperate for them. Canada had abandoned all its trade schools, had very, very few qualified machinists, and they would hire anybody that they could either fly in, boat in, or anyone get into the country. And we just don't have great education systems. We don't have great trade school systems, and we have not dedicated vast swaths of the Yukon or Texas to build these giant hub factories that can satisfy.
But again, part of that is because we have moved it offshore. The Times quotes a manufacturer of screws in Lockhart, Texas. The Caldwell Manufacturing Company, they made 28,000 screws for Apple, but the owner and president, Stephen Mello, said when he bought Caldwell in 2002, it was capable of the high-volume production Apple needed, but demand had dried up as manufacturing moved to China. So, this is something Apple's brought on in some respects, right? He said that he had replaced the old stamping presses that could mass-produce screws with machines designed for more precise, specialized jobs because people are going to go to China to get the cheap stuff. And so we're going to have to make something that is not quite so cheap.
Yeah. Realize that every time a manufacturing plant shuts down in the United States, the tooling and the machinery is usually shipped to China. They're usually bought by a Chinese factory. When the history of the world for the past century is written, it will be acknowledged that one of the most transformative, both from a financial, labor, and a cultural perspective, is the invention of the container ship. That makes it really, really easy to build something or manufacture a part halfway across the world and have it shipped across. And Rene is absolutely right. I think one part of the problem is that the United States and other countries just realize too late how important it is to invest in labor, to make sure as part of your critical infrastructure, you are supporting labor, people working and making things, because China did absolutely that. They again, based on whatever advantages they had because of their government setup, they have the ability to simply say we have lots and lots of people, we have lots of hands to build lots and lots of things. Now we have the ability to have a marketplace of the entire world. We're going to take advantage of this.
The Times also points out that another problem with manufacturing in the U.S., American workers don't work around the clock.
Yeah,
China's not. They quote an economics professor from Case Western. China's not just cheap; it's a place where, because it's an authoritarian government, you can marshal 100,000 people to work all night for you. And that's an essential part of the product rollout strategy. Apple doesn't want to start making this stuff in April. So, the fact that we can crank out more in a shorter period of time is important.
We have night shifts here. Gruber took exception to that because his father worked the night shift for decades. Yeah. And we have night shifts and weekend workers here.
I guess
that part's weird.
Okay,
yeah, but what we don't have in the United States anymore is the infrastructure of manufacturing. It's part of our history, but all companies, not just tech companies, but companies started getting things manufactured overseas. That's what happened. So to kind of we should just bring back factory workers and bring back factories. It's so much bigger than that. Just one company can't just suddenly, buy a building and suddenly have screws manufactured for them for the rest of their lives. We as a country decided that we didn't want to be a manufacturing company, and now we're wondering why we can't, fill jobs for people in the United States because we pushed all of those jobs overseas and can't bring it back. The ability to do it is large. All companies would need to come back to the U.S. if we were going to reestablish a strong manufacturing culture in the United States. It can't just be one company or 1 year. It has to everybody has to do it to bring it back to the U.S. Actually,
there was a spike in overnight night shift workers over the last couple of decades in the United States. And the last number I saw is 3.2% of the entire workforce works overnight. So we do have overnight workers. But,
but
I don't know if we have slave labor that work for $2 an hour.
Slave labor is a hard word because there is such a thing as slave labor in the world. The difference is that we do have fundamental protections for labor. Labor has a certain amount of power that lots of politicians have been trying to chip away at, and governors from the states have been trying to chip away at year after year after year. But there is a fundamental system in place that says that there is a certain level of abuse that you cannot inflict upon a labor force, even if that labor force is willing to be abused, but because they need that job so badly. The last thing I want is for us to go back to what the situation was like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where really anything goes. We had an unregulated labor industry, and we had unregulated relationships between corporate entities and their labor. These. I'm so sorry. I've been very, very stumbly. What I'm saying is that we had a system of no laws for a while. We saw how badly companies were treating workers without any regulations overseeing them, and we saw what happened. We decided as a country we did not want that to happen. And the result is that now we have a system where people have a right to be paid. They have a right to be safe. I'm not necessarily sure that the same is true all over the world, and that's our disadvantage as long as we have cargo ships going all the way across the world.
And that's where it doesn't cost as much money to make people that are in unregulated countries work long hours with no safety measures in place to make sure that they're healthy. So that's the payoff. We in the United States decided that we didn't want to treat ourselves so poorly, so we put regulations in place to protect ourselves, and then the end result is that the companies just went somewhere else and did it to someone else. So it would be so great to bring back this kind of labor in the United States, as long as we could obviously keep the same protections in place for workers, so that you only work a 40-hour week, or you get paid overtime for the extra work that you do, that you have a certain amount of hours per day that you get to rest and leave, to go be with your family, things like that. Those are all part of those regulations put in place to protect workers. So if we could have that, pay them a wage that was sustainable to their families, and have manufacturing in the United States, that would be great. Everybody wants that, including these giant corporations that have moved overseas. They want that too. They would love that. It would be great. But it's not happening right now under, by asking one company to come back or something like that,
As Studs Terkel said time and time again, if you got to go home at 5 p.m., if you did not have to work on Sunday, thank the people who got shot in the middle of Chicago, labor organizers and protesters who bought you that right several decades ago.